It's been 10 years since Russia annexed Crimea in 2014. In 10 years, a lot of things changed, but the question is whether life got better or worse for local people. That's what we are about to find out in this video. For those who are the first time here, my name is Zach the Russian. I'm 22 years old Russian who left Russia because of the war against Ukraine. And in this video, we're gonna see in numbers how life changed in Crimea under the Russian occupation. Let's start with economy. Crimea, whether it was Ukrainian or Russian, was never able to provide enough for themselves. They had to be subsidized either by the Ukrainian government or Russian government. But the question is when Crimea was actually more dependent on the federal budget in Ukraine or in Russia. Nowadays, when Crimea is under the Russian occupation, they can only provide for 1/4 of the whole budget for themselves. For example, in 2022, Crimea was only able to make 66 billions of rubles, while the whole budget was actually 189 billions of rubles. Since Putin wants to make a Crimea as a gem of Russia, they've started to invest tons of money into the region. And the money flow never stopped since the annexation. For example, for a city of Sevastopol in Crimea, which is a port, a biggest city in Crimea, in 2014 they were given 19.5 billions of rubles from the federal budget, while in 2024 Sevastopol was actually given 32.1 billions of rubles, almost 2 times more than in 2014. So overall, the government started to invest a lot of money in Crimea from the federal budget to make a gem to show the whole world that Russian occupation is actually doing good. But does it really? Since Russia annexed Crimea, which is against international law, most of the Western countries sanctioned Russia and specifically the region Crimea itself, which eventually affected the life of average people drastically. For example, the whole banking system was a failure because all those Russian banks like Sberbank, VTB, Alfa Bank, Tinkoff Bank, none of them actually opened their banks in Crimea. They were afraid to put their offices on the territory of Crimea because they could have been cut off of SWIFT, and that would mean basically sanctions. So basically for 8 years, locals had some kind of local banks which had really bad rates. You couldn't really trust those banks. Who knows what's going to happen to your money in 10 or 15 years? Imagine just you don't know what's going to happen to those banks in 10 years. Are they going to close? What's going to happen to your money? Nobody knew. And only after Putin already full-scale invasion Ukraine in 2022, Sberbank, the main bank of Russia basically, opened the first office in Sevastopol only in 2023, after they were completely cut off SWIFT. So basically they had nothing else to lose. Another service which didn't work in Crimea is Yandex. Yandex, as a main competitor of Google in Russia, is the main service if you need taxi, if you need food delivery, if you need to Google search something. So basically this is the main service, imagine like Google in Russia. So what happened is Yandex decided not to come to Crimea. They were afraid of sanctions because Yandex worked in a lot of other Western countries and they were afraid of sanctions. The biggest cellular providers, MTS, Megafon, Beeline, they were all afraid to get into Crimea because otherwise they would get sanctioned and it would be more hard for them to get equipment they need for work from outside of Russia. Even the postal service of Russia didn't work in Crimea. Even the freaking governmental postal service, they were afraid of sanctions. Imagine USPS wouldn't work in, I don't know, Alaska. They'd be like, no, we don't want this. They're gonna sanction us. Speaking of groceries, a lot of Russian grocery stores didn't open their stores in Crimea. For example, X5 Retail, which is basically the biggest company in Russia that owns most of the grocery stores, they didn't open a single store because they were afraid of sanctions too, which led to a lower competition on the grocery market. And eventually the prices, because of the lack of competition, went up. Overall prices for groceries in Crimea are average to Russian prices. But if you just cross the bridge and go to Krasnodarsky Krai, the prices for groceries there are going to be 30% less than in Crimea, while the income of the locals is about the same. Residents of Crimea, because of the sanctions, couldn't use any of those American or Western services such as Netflix or YouTube Music, for example. You couldn't pay for your Spotify. They only could use it with VPN. But the thing is, like, they were supposed to put like Russian VPN instead of Crimean. If you would put Moscow's VPN, it would definitely work because all of those services worked in Russia before 2022. I should have a VPN promotion here, but nobody decided to sponsor me for this video. But if you want me to sponsor for the next one, here's your opportunity. My email in the description below. And only when Putin started the full invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Western companies blocked it for citizens of Russians overall, not only Crimeans. It's kind of funny, but even AliExpress, which is basically a Chinese marketplace, they refused to send parcels to Crimea because they were afraid of sanctions. What they would do, for example, if they would need to buy something from AliExpress and to deliver it to Sevastopol, they would basically write, instead of O's, they would write it with zeros. And so the AliExpress system wouldn't be able to identify that the parcels actually go into Crimea. Since 2014 all the way until 2018, Crimea was isolated from mainland Ukraine. And because of this, they weren't able to have a constant supply of food, of water, and other things. And only in 2018, when Putin built a Crimean bridge, they started to have full supply from the mainland Russia into Crimea. However, after 2022 and the constant attacks on Crimean bridge, which I have a video about, by the way, the supply started to shrink. Plus, Crimea doesn't produce as much itself to fulfill all the needs of the population. Crimean production only fulfills 30% of its needs. The main thing that Crimea lacks is eggs, chicken, milk, and vegetables. 50% of dairy products are imported into Crimea from Russia, and up to 30% of any kind of meat is being imported from Russia too. Even though Crimea has good soil, but they still are not capable to grow enough to fulfill their needs. And the reason for this is because the amount of land they can use for farming went down by 10 times since the annexation of Crimea. And the main reason for this is because Crimea, before Putin started his invasion, didn't have enough water to use it for farming. Before 2014, Crimea also lacked water. But what happened is they would just take it from the mainland Ukraine, from the river called Dnieper, and they would just put it through pipes to Crimea. But since Putin violated Ukrainian sovereignty in 2014 and annexed its territory, Ukraine didn't really want to give its own water for Russian Crimea under occupation. And so because of that, most of the farming started to die out because they just don't have enough water to fully meet the needs. Every year, Crimea itself has about 300 million of cubic meters of water, while the population's consumption is only about 100 million of cubic meters. However, the water is not spread equally throughout Crimea, somewhere more, somewhere less. It needs to be transported from one part to another one, which is an expensive process. Because of all these water problems, sometimes local authorities has even restrict the access to the water. For example, in 2021, the authorities of a small town called Alushty restricted the access to the water for only 5 hours. To sum up about water, Crimea can gather up needed sources themselves. However, it's not enough for farming purposes. They cannot keep the same amount of farming as when Crimea was Ukrainian. Now in 2024, 2 years after the full invasion, when Putin pushed the border from Crimea deeper in the mainland Ukraine, now he has finally access to the water from Dnieper River, which solves the problem Crimea faced for about 8 years. But the problems wouldn't take place at all if Putin would not annex Crimea, and the locals would not suffer. Income of locals, did it go up or down? On average, Crimean residents started to make more money if counting in US dollars. In 2013, an average salary in Crimea was only $350 per month, while in 2015, it was already $680. An average Crimean in 2013 could buy 8 grocery baskets, while in 2018, it was already 10 grocery baskets. BBC counted that after Russia annexed Crimea, it became easier by 7% for locals to afford to buy apartments. You would guess that after Russia annexed Crimea, Putin would try to match the Crimean average salaries with the average salaries on the federal level. However, in the past 5 years, actually this gap between an average salary in Crimea and a federal salary even got bigger. In 2023, an average salary in Crimea was 46,825 rubles, while on the federal level, the average salary was 73,609 rubles. Basically, an average Crimean makes a quarter less than an average Russian, but still more when Crimea was under Ukraine. Let's speak about farming and tourism which are two main sources of income for Crimea. Crimea specializes in specific types of agriculture. Primarily, it focuses on grape production. In recent years, much has been done in Crimea to develop winemaking. And secondly, on vegetables, fruits, and berries, such as cherries, apricots, and peaches. From 2014 to 2022, the volume of sold agricultural products increased by 145.6 kilotons, while the amount of meat sold decreased by 14.4 kilotons compared to 10 years ago. Speaking of tourism, the level of tourism hasn't changed drastically. According to the Russian Statistical Agency, in 2023, the tourist flow to Crimea amounted to 5.2 million of people, the same as Ukrainian specialists counted in 2013, before the annexation. The number of vacationers on the peninsula decreased after the start of the war and the coronavirus pandemic. Before this, Crimea had set tourism records for the 2 consecutive years in the entire post-Soviet period. 6.8 million people vacationed here in 2018 and 7.4 million of people in 2014. Right after the annexation, Putin made a bet on the construction in Crimea, mostly the construction and developing of roads, and of course the Crimean Bridge. A poll from 2015 stated that 44% of Crimeans mentioned problems with roads when asking to the question, what are the main problems in Crimea? But in 2021, another poll showed that 92% of Crimeans stated that there is a better change in the road infrastructure. Overall, since 2014 all the way to 2023, about 4,000 kilometers of roads has either been built or fixed. In 10 years, Russia has allocated 1.3 trillions of rubles for developing the roads. The most notable of the projects is considered to be the Crimean Bridge, costing 228 billion rubles, approximately $3.5 billion. Putin personally attended the opening in 2018, and the bridge even got its own mascot in the form of a cat named Mostik. The large-scale construction was entrusted to Arkady Rotenberg's company, a childhood friend of Vladimir Putin from St. Petersburg. Not a lot of people know, but the Ukrainian authorities also attempted to build the Crimean Bridge and even signed an agreement about developing the project in 2010 between Viktor Yanukovych and Dmitry Medvedev, the president of Russia at that time. Freedom. And as it usually happens, Putin is trying to raise the level of life of people, but at the same time, he takes one of the most important things in the society: freedom. In 10 years, at least 173 politically motivated felony cases were opened in Crimea. According to United Nations data from January 1st, 2017 to June 30th, 2018, there were 95 house searches conducted in Crimea on charges of terrorism and extremism. Of these, 86% involved in Crimean Tatars. At least 104 residents of Crimea had been kidnapped by the government and nobody knows what happened to them or where they are. United Nations registered at least 55 cases of torture. The amount of political oppression towards people who don't agree with Putin rose by 2 times since the beginning of the war against Ukraine. Ukrainian Orthodox Church, the church that was created in 1990 as a separate Orthodox Church, which is not going to be dependent on the Patriarch in Moscow, they have built their own churches in Crimea. Once Putin annexed Crimea in 2014, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church was prohibited on the territory of Crimea, and 17 of their churches was actually taken over by the Russian Orthodox Church. Overall, the amount of registered religious organization in Crimea from 2083 decreased to 907. Social workers. Once Putin annexed Crimea, a lot of social workers got fired or quit. The number of teachers and medical workers sharply decreased in Crimea in 2014, each by 5,000. 13% of doctors in Crimea resigned, leaving only 9,641 doctors. In 2014, Crimea lost nearly 5,500 teachers and professors. In the 2023-2024 academic year, according to the Russian Ministry of Education, the number of teachers fell to 17,000. The peninsula needs at least 500 more teachers, mainly Russian language and mathematics teachers. But the expenses for police, for army, for Rosgvardia to fight protests increased drastically. In 2017, Crimea spent 29.5 million rubles on national defense and 1.2 billion rubles on the work of security forces. Over 5 years, by 2021, these figures grew by 50% and 30% respectively. Defense spending exceeded 46.5 million rubles, and spending on security forces reached 1.6 billion rubles. Population. Since 2014, the population of the peninsula went down. According to the Ukrainian statistics, in 2013 and 2014, about 1.97 million of people lived in Crimea. However, in the first couple of years, about 100,000 of Ukrainians has left Crimea. The largest wave of migration occurred in the first 6 months of the annexation, when local activists were expelled, Ukrainian media were blocked, and other oppressive measures were implemented. The second wave, in 2015-2016, was triggered by business oppression, when entrepreneurs were deprived of license, premises, and land. As a matter of fact, 15 out of 74 judges in the Crimean Republican Court not from Crimea. They are newcomers from other regions of Russia. For you as a resident of Crimea, it's really hard to leave not only to Ukraine, but also to Europe. Some countries refuse to issue Schengen visas to peninsula residents due to the unrecognized status of the occupied territory. Let's speak about citizenship of residents of Crimea. Basically, in 2014, after annexation, Russia just said, okay, all Ukrainian citizens living in Crimea, you are Russian citizens now, and they were giving away the Russian passports. Those who refused to get the Russian passport eventually got deported, and the number of the people is 894. If you were a Crimean with a Ukrainian passport working on some kind of municipal government or some kind of local government, you couldn't have a second citizenship. It was prohibited, even though by the Russian law it's not. It was just they didn't want those people to have Ukrainian citizenships anymore. They wanted them to pledge their loyalty to Russia. A lot of Ukrainians who has left Crimea after the Russian annexation and didn't do anything, didn't re-register their property, eventually lost their property. So basically, Russian government stolen the property. About 6,000 premises were stolen from Ukrainian citizens, including one really interesting apartment of actually the current president of Ukraine, Vladimir Zelensky. Russian government decided to give away land to Russian soldiers fighting in a special military operation, basically a war against Ukraine. And from 2022 to 2023, they gave away about 730 land pieces to the Russian soldiers killing Ukrainians. Russia violated international law big time, and especially by making Crimea work by the Russian law. Already by January 2015, everything was working by the Russian law. And there were a case which contradicts the Russian law itself. In 2017, one of the leaders of Crimean Tatars was given 8 years in prison for organizing mass protest in 2014 against Russian occupation of Crimea. And basically, what he was doing was still under jurisdiction of Ukrainian law, and it was not a crime. But before Russia pledged him guilty, even though the Russian law didn't start working before January 2015, 1 year before. It contradicts to Russian law, to Ukrainian law, to international law. Of course, they didn't want locals to protest against the Russian occupation. By Russian law, if you want to have a protest or a massive gathering or something else, you have to ask a permission from local authorities to have this kind of event. But there is a list of places where you can have this event. And the list is usually registered. You can't just come up with a random name, a random street, or a random park. There is a list of those places. Before, in 2014, the amount of places where you could have a protest publicly was about 665 places. You could choose from those places, any of those in Crimea, and go have your protest. Well, register first, get approved, and then have protest. However, this list of places where you can have a protest shrinked throughout years. And already in 2 years, in 2016, the amount of places you can actually have a protest was only 366, almost 2 times less. Another thing which violates international law big time is prohibition of Ukrainian language. One of the things that Russia always complains about when talking about Ukraine, oh, they ban Russian language, oh, they ban Russian culture. Okay, let's see what Russia does to Ukrainian culture first, by the way, before the full-scale invasion started. Before annexation of Crimea, most of the Crimeans spoke in Russian. But there were still Ukrainians who wanted to speak Ukrainian. There were basically 2 main languages in Crimea. And there were a lot of families who were giving their children to study in Ukrainian-speaking schools. The amount of children who studied in Ukrainian-speaking schools in Crimea was about 12,500 students. However, in 2017, only 132 kids were studying in the Ukrainian school. almost all Ukrainian-spoken schools were closed. Speaking of the culture, Crimea had this one Ukrainian-speaking newspaper. It was called Кримская Светлица. And already a couple of months after the annexation, it was completely banned by the Russian authorities. And of course, Russia needs men for wars, they need to train them, they need to conscript them, they need to mobilize them. In 10 years, Russia has conscripted about 30,000 of Ukrainian men, which violates the international law. You cannot conscript men from occupied territory. This is one of the reasons why a lot of young men who's supposed to drive economy actually left Crimea, because they just don't want to serve in the Russian army. Let's conclude. In 10 years, Crimeans on average started to live better. They started to make more money in US dollars, they started to be able to afford more food, it became easier to afford housing. However, at the same time, a lot of the people were oppressed, put in jail, Ukrainian language was prohibited, property rights were violated. So basically this strategy of Putin to keep full fridges and to take people's freedoms is working. This is what he has been doing past 20 years, and he's pretty successful at that, I'm not gonna lie. It was me, Zach the Russian. I hope that one day Crimea will return to Ukraine and the international law is going to be restored. Thank you for Russian media called Verska for an interesting article about how Crimea changed in 10 years. I've also taken some information for this video from United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. They have a really interesting paper about 10 years of occupation of Crimea. There is also ways to support my channel. There are links in the description below. Thank you for watching this video. See ya in the next one.